All right, my slightly overheated time traveler. I'm glad you drifted in. If today felt warm, imagine carrying Celtic traditions beneath the wide sunlit skies of Anatolia. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet story of the Galatians, Celts who wandered far from misty hills and found themselves among dry plains, olive groves, and relentless summer heat. Not as conquerors in a rush, but as people adapting slowly, carrying memory, language, and law across unfamiliar ground. If you're new here, feel free to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, settle into stillness, let the warmth fade, and we'll begin. You're settling in for a journey through one of history's quieter transformations, the story of Celtic warriors who crossed into Anatolia around 280 BCE and became the Galatians, a people caught between their northern roots and the Mediterranean sun. This isn't a tale of conquest or dramatic battles, but rather the slow, unremarkable process of adaptation as families from Gaul learn to live in a landscape nothing like home. Let's follow them into that unfamiliar warmth, where everything, from the soil to the gods, required rethinking. You need to understand something about the Celts before they ever set foot in Anatolia. These weren't people with a unified kingdom or a capital city. They lived in scattered tribes across what we now call France, Belgium, and parts of Germany, each group loyal to its own chieftain and its own patch of land. They grew barley and wheat, raised cattle, worked iron, and told stories around fires that smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Their world was green, often damp, and shaped by forests that stretched farther than most people would travel in a lifetime. Life moved according to seasons that were generous with rain. Spring came late, summer was brief, autumn lasted long enough to harvest, and winter settled in like a relative who wouldn't leave. The Celts built homes with thick walls and steep roofs to shed water. They wore wool and fur, brewed beer from grain, and understood their gods as forces tied to rivers, groves, and hilltops. Every stream had a spirit, every crossroads a guardian. Religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was daily life, woven into planting, herding, and deciding when to fight. War was common, but not constant. Tribes clashed over grazing rights, trade routes, or insults real or imagined. Warriors carried long swords and oval shields, fought on foot or from chariots, and considered bravery the highest virtue. But warfare wasn't total or industrial. Battles were often ritualized, personal, and over quickly. Afterward, people went back to farming. Even the fiercest warrior spent most of his time mending fences or sharpening plough blades. Celtic society had structure, but not the kind you'd recognize from later empires. At the top were the chiefs and nobles, families with land and cattle. Below them were free farmers, craftsmen and herders. At the bottom were slaves, usually captives from raids. Druids, priests, judges and teachers held their own kind of power, separate from wealth or weapons. They memorized laws, presided over rituals, and settled disputes. If a druid said you were in the wrong, you were in the wrong, even if you were the richest man in the village. Women had rights that would surprise you if you only knew the Celtic world through Roman descriptions. They could own property, divorce, and in some tribes, even lead. Not every tribe treated women the same way, but the general pattern was closer to partnership than subjugation. A woman might inherit land, run a household's trade dealings, or rarely fight alongside men. Roman writers found this so strange, they made a point of mentioning it, usually with disapproval. By the early 3rd century BCE, things were shifting. The Celts weren't isolated anymore. Greek traders had been moving through their territories for generations, bringing wine, pottery, and ideas. Some Celtic chiefs adopted Greek tastes, decorating their halls with imported goods and hiring Greek tutors for their children. But most people still lived as their grandparents had, farming the same fields, worshipping the same gods, and speaking the same languages. Then came pressure from the east. The tribes that would become the Galatians weren't fleeing disaster exactly, but they were feeling crowded. Population growth, disputes over land, and the lure of opportunities elsewhere all played a role. Some young warriors were restless. Some chiefs saw a chance to gain wealth and prestige by leading followers to new territory. Migration wasn't unusual for the Celts. Tribes had been moving, splitting, and recombining for centuries. This was just another shift, though none of them knew yet how far it would take them. Around 281 BCE, a leader named Brennus gathered a coalition of tribes and led them south toward Greece. Not the Brennus who supposedly sacked Rome a century earlier. Different man, same name. This Brennus was ambitious, charismatic, and willing to take risks. He convinced thousands of warriors and their families to follow him toward the warm lands they'd heard about in stories, where cities were rich and ripe for plunder. The expedition didn't end well. Brennus died during a failed attack on the sacred site of Delphi, and the coalition fell apart. But not everyone went home. Some groups kept moving, looking for a place to settle. One of these groups, led by a chieftain named Leonorios and another named Lutarios, pushed farther east. They crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, around 278 BCE. They weren't invading in the formal sense. They were looking for land, employment, or both. The kingdoms of Anatolia, always short on skilled fighters, saw an opportunity. These Celts could be hired as mercenaries, settled in buffer zones, and used to keep other threats at bay. So they crossed. Thousands of people. Warriors, yes, but also their wives, children, elders, and all the livestock and belongings they could carry. They brought their language, their gods, their tools, and their way of organizing the world. What they didn't bring was experience living in a place where summer felt like a punishment, and rain was a gift instead of a given. They were about to learn what it meant to be strangers in a land that didn't care about their traditions. Before they arrived, before they saw the Anatolian plateau, or felt the weight of that heat, they were still just Celts, people from the green north, shaped by forests and fog. That identity wouldn't disappear overnight, but it would bend gradually under the pressure of a new climate, new neighbors, and new challenges. The Galatians were about to be born, though the Celts crossing into Asia Minor didn't know it yet. They just knew they were moving, and the world ahead was unfamiliar. You're walking with them now in your mind as they make their way through Thrace and towards the Hellespont. The landscape is already different from what they knew. Fewer trees, more open sky. The air has a quality to it, drier, somehow sharper. The warriors march in loose formation, but this isn't an army in the way you'd picture it. It's a migration. Families travel in wagons piled with belongings. Children dart between the animals. Old people ride when they can and walk when they must. Everyone is dusty, tired, and uncertain. The crossing of the Hellespont isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a logistical headache spread over days. They need boats, lots of them, and they don't have enough. Some are borrowed, some stolen, and some negotiated from local fishermen who probably regret the deal. The strait is narrow, but the water is deep and the current is tricky. People who've never been on a boat suddenly find themselves crammed onto one with strangers, livestock, and the creeping fear that comes from trusting your life to wood and water. Imagine the smell: wet wool, unwashed bodies, animal dung, and the salt of the sea mixing with the metallic tang of fear. Some people get seasick, some animals panic, children cry. Warriors try to maintain dignity while gripping the sides of boats like their lives depend on it, which, to be fair, they do. The ones who know how to swim feel a little better. The ones who don't pray to every god they can name. On the other side, Anatolia waits. It's late spring, and the land is still green in places, though not the kind of green they're used to. This green is paler and dustier, already showing signs of the heat to come. The hills roll differently here, longer and lower. The trees are different too. More pines, more scrub, and fewer of the thick oaks and beeches that filled the forest back home. The sky feels bigger, as if someone stretched it wider when they weren't looking. They're moving through a region that doesn't particularly want them, but doesn't have the strength to turn them away. The local kingdoms are in flux, always jockeying for position, always worried about each other. The arrival of thousands of Celtic warriors is both a threat and an opportunity. King Nicomedes of Bithynia is the first to see the opportunity. He offers them land and payment in exchange for military service. Other rulers will do the same. The Celts, for their part, are happy to take what's offered. Fighting is familiar. Settling somewhere safe sounds good. But first, they have to get there. The march inland is harder than the crossing. The roads, if you can call them that, are rougher than they expected. Water is less predictable. Back home, you could count on streams and springs. Here, water is still around, but you have to know where to look. The locals know. The Celts are learning. People start noticing things. How the locals dress. Lighter fabrics, fewer layers. How they build. Flat roofs instead of steep ones. Windows facing away from the sun. How they eat. Less meat, more grains. Lots of oil from those strange twisted trees. The heat arrives before they're ready for it. June in Anatolia isn't like June in Gaul. It's dry and relentless, the kind of heat that makes you rethink everything. Wool clothing becomes unbearable. Metal armor burns to the touch if left in the sun. People start shedding layers, adopting local styles out of pure necessity. The older folks complain. The younger ones adapt faster. Children, as always, adjust quickest of all. Nights are strange. The temperature drops, but not the way it did back home. The air stays warm, almost sticky. The stars are different too, brighter, sharper, and arranged in patterns no one recognizes. Some of the druids try to reorient their knowledge, mapping familiar constellations onto this unfamiliar sky. Others admit quietly that they're lost. Navigation has always been part of their role, but how do you navigate when the sky itself has changed? They pass through Greek cities on the coast, Byzantium, Chalcedon, and others. These cities are older and stranger than anything the Celts have encountered. Stone buildings rise higher than seems reasonable. Markets buzz with languages they don't understand. The smells are intense. Spices, fish, incense, sewage. People stare at the Celts as they pass. Some with fear, some with curiosity, and some with the kind of disdain reserved for barbarians. The Celts stare back, equally bewildered. There's an incident in one city. A warrior, young and hot-headed, gets into an argument with a Greek merchant over the price of bread. The argument escalates. Swords are drawn. The chieftain intervenes, pays triple for the bread, and drags the warrior away. Later, around the fire, the chieftain explains that they're guests here, whether they like it or not. Fighting the locals won't end well. The warrior nods, embarrassed. Everyone understands the lesson, even if they don't like it. The march continues. They're heading for the Central Plateau, the region that will become known as Galatia. It's a high country, cooler than the coast, but still warmer than home. The landscape is open, good for grazing, and less good for the kind of farming they're used to. The soil is different, rockier, drier. The plants are different. The animals are different. Everything is different, and it's starting to sink in that different might be permanent. By the time they reach the territory Nicomedes has granted them, it's summer, full blazing Anatolian summer, the kind that makes you understand why midday rest isn't laziness. It's survival. They set up camp, start building shelters, and begin the long process of figuring out how to live here. Some people are excited, some are homesick. Most are too busy to think about it much. There's work to do, fences to build, fields to clear, agreements to make with neighboring tribes who aren't thrilled about the new arrivals. The crossing is over. They're here now, for better or worse. The Celts who left Gaul are starting to become something else. They don't have a name for it yet. Galatian is a word that will come later, given to them by others. For now, they're just people trying to figure out how to live in a place that doesn't feel like home and probably never will. But home is behind them, across water and mountains, and a distance too great to cross casually. This is where they are. This is where they'll stay. You're watching them settle slowly into a rhythm that doesn't quite fit yet. The land they've been granted sits on the Anatolian plateau, a high rolling plain that stretches between mountain ranges. It's not bad land, but it's not what they expected. The Celts are used to working with what they have, and they're doing that here, but everything requires translation. The tools they brought work, but not as well. The crops they know how to grow need adjustments. The animals they brought need different grazing patterns. 3 main tribes dominate this new Celtic presence in Anatolia. The Tolistobogi settle in the west near the Sangarius River. The Tectusages take the center, around the area that will later become the city of Ancyra, modern Ankara. The Trochmi settle in the east, closer to Pontus. Each tribe operates semi-independently, with its own chiefs and councils, but they maintain loose alliances and occasional assemblies where disputes are settled and decisions affecting all the Galatians are made. This structure is familiar. It's how they organized back home. It gives them some continuity in a place where little else feels continuous. The first year is about survival, learning the growing season, figuring out where water is reliable, and understanding which local plants are edible and which will make you sick. The Celts are practical people. They ask questions, watch their neighbors, make mistakes, and adjust. They hire local farmers as advisors, though the language barrier makes everything slower. Gestures and demonstration become the common language. A Greek-speaking freedman becomes invaluable just because he can translate between the Celts and the native Anatolians. The heat remains the biggest challenge. It's not just uncomfortable, it changes how you work. You can't labor through midday the way you could back home. You have to start early, rest when the sun is high, and resume in the late afternoon. This feels like laziness at first, especially to the older warriors who pride themselves on endurance. But the ones who ignore the heat collapse, sometimes dangerously. The lesson sinks in. Even the stubbornest warrior learns to nap in the shade. Housing evolves. The first shelters are temporary, tents and rough wooden structures that resemble what they built on the march. But these don't work well in the heat. Thick walls that kept cold out now trap heat in. Steep roofs designed to shed rain are unnecessary here. Slowly, they start borrowing local techniques. Flat roofs made of clay and straw, thick stone walls that stay cool during the day, small windows placed strategically to catch breezes. The houses they build start looking less like Celtic roundhouses and more like Anatolian village homes, though they keep some elements of the old style. Central hearths, even if they're not used as often, and layouts that reflect Celtic social structures. Food is another area of negotiation. The Celts brought their taste for meat, beer, and heavy stews. Anatolia offers different staples: olive oil, wine, flatbreads, and legumes. Game is less abundant than it was in the northern forests. Hunting parties return with smaller catches. Fish becomes more important, though the Celts aren't traditionally seafaring people. They learn to use olive oil, grudgingly at first, then with growing appreciation. It keeps better in the heat than animal fat. Wine replaces beer for many, simply because grapes grow well here and barley struggles in the dry soil. Bread changes too. The Celts are used to dense, heavy loaves baked in clay ovens. Here, bread is flatter, lighter, and cooked quickly on hot stones or in shallow ovens. It's practical for the climate, but it feels wrong. Food is deeply tied to identity. Changing what you eat feels like changing who you are. Some families resist, clinging to old recipes, grinding imported grain to make bread that tastes like home. Others adapt faster, finding that the local bread is easier to make and perfectly fine once you get used to it. Children adapt fastest, as they always do. The second generation, born in Anatolia, or brought as infants, doesn't remember the green forests of Gaul. This is their normal. They grow up bilingual, speaking Celtic at home, and picking up Greek or native Anatolian languages in the market. They play with local children, learn local games, and absorb local customs without thinking about it. Their parents watch this with mixed feelings. Relief that their children are thriving, and worry that they're losing something essential. The warriors remain culturally conservative. Fighting is what defines them, and they cling to Celtic martial traditions even as other aspects of life change. They keep their long swords, their oval shields, and their preference for individual combat over the disciplined formations of Greek and Macedonian armies. Local rulers hire them precisely because they're different, fierce, unpredictable, and effective in ways that complement more conventional troops. This gives the Galatian warriors a sense of pride and purpose. They're valued for being Celtic, which makes it easier to stay Celtic, but military service also brings contact. Galatian warriors serve alongside Greeks, Anatolians, Armenians, and others. They share camps, fight in the same battles, and swap stories around fires. Slowly, they pick up other languages, other fighting techniques, and other ways of thinking. A young Galatian warrior returns from a campaign having learned basic Greek and developed a taste for wine mixed with honey, the way his Greek comrades drink it. He's still Galatian, still proud of his heritage, but he's also starting to be something new. The Druids struggle more than most. Their role depends on continuity, remembering laws, maintaining traditions, and preserving the sacred knowledge passed down through generations. In Gaul, They studied for decades, memorizing vast amounts of information because writing was forbidden for religious knowledge. Here, surrounded by literate Greeks and Anatolians, that prohibition seems less absolute. Some Druids remain purists. Others, pragmatically, start learning to read and write, justifying it as a tool for preserving what might otherwise be lost. Religion is complicated. The gods traveled with them. Everyone agrees on that. But do the gods have the same power here? The sacred groves are gone, replaced by open land under a harsh sun. New shrines are established, but they don't feel the same. Some Druids argue that the gods are universal, present everywhere. Others worry that distance from the sacred sites of Gaul has weakened the connection. Rituals continue, but with modifications. Animal sacrifices remain central, but the animals are different. Omens are read in the flight of local birds and the behavior of unfamiliar weather patterns. There's a practicality to Galatian religion that helps. It was never dogmatic. It was about maintaining balance, showing respect, and ensuring prosperity. If a ritual doesn't work, you adjust it. If a new location requires new practices, you develop them. Flexibility is built into the system, so the Druids adapt slowly, trying to maintain the core while allowing the surface to change. It's uncomfortable, but it's survivable. Towns start to form. The Celts weren't urban people, but life in Anatolia pushed them in that direction. Scattered farms are vulnerable. Markets are far away. Protection requires clustering together. The settlements that emerge are hybrid. Celtic tribal organization overlaid on Anatolian town layouts. They have councils and chiefs, but also agoras and marketplaces. They're fortified, but with stone walls rather than wooden palisades. They're becoming something that neither the Celts nor the Anatolians quite recognize. The first decade is the hardest. That's when the differences are sharpest and the homesickness most acute. But people are resilient. They find ways to live. They learn what works and what doesn't. They make friends with their neighbors, marry into local families, start businesses, and have children. The Galatians are taking root, slowly, like a plant transferred to unfamiliar soil. It's not the same as the original. It might never feel entirely natural, but it's alive and it's growing. You're adjusting your internal clock to match theirs, feeling the way their days reshape around the sun's demands. Summer in central Anatolia is an exercise in heat management. Mornings start before dawn, when the air is almost cool and the light is pale and forgiving. This is when you do the heavy work, ploughing, harvesting, hauling water, fixing fences. People move efficiently, trying to accomplish as much as possible before the heat arrives in earnest. By mid-morning, the sun is already asserting itself. Shadows shrink. The air takes on a thick quality, like something you push through rather than breathe. Work slows. People retreat to whatever shade they can find. The midday break isn't optional. Animals seek shelter instinctively. Humans learn to do the same. This is when the Anatolian plateau goes quiet. No birds sing. No one travels. Even conversation feels like too much effort. Inside the houses, people rest. Some sleep. Others sit in the relative cool, doing quiet tasks that don't require much movement. Women weave, mend clothes, or prepare food for later. Men repair tools, tell slow stories, or just sit. Children are supposed to rest too, though they're less convinced of the necessity. They squirm, fidget, and whisper complaints about being bored. Eventually the heat wins. Even the most energetic child succumbs to drowsiness. Late afternoon brings a shift. The sun angles lower. Shadows lengthen. A breeze, if you're lucky, stirs the air. This is when life resumes. Fields fill again with workers. Animals are led to pasture. The market, empty at midday, comes alive. People who've been hidden away emerge, ready to accomplish the second half of the day's tasks. There's a social aspect to this too. After hours of isolation, people are ready to interact. Conversations happen, news spreads, business is conducted, water shapes everything. The Celts came from a place where water was abundant, often excessive. Here, it's precious. They learn to conserve, to prioritize, and to make every drop count. Wells are communal resources, carefully managed. Irrigation is essential, but requires planning and cooperation. Disputes over water rights become common, requiring the wisdom of chiefs and druids to resolve. The old laws from Gaul have provisions for water management, but they're based on rivers and rain. New rules have to be developed for a drier world. Clothing changes in ways both practical and symbolic. Wool, the foundation of Celtic dress, is too heavy for Anatolian summers. Linen becomes more common, adopted from local practice. Men start wearing lighter tunics, sometimes with bare legs, a style that would have been embarrassing back home, but here is simply sensible. Women adjust their long dresses, using thinner fabrics and shorter sleeves. Colors shift too. The heavy, dark wools favored in the north are replaced by lighter shades that reflect heat rather than absorb it. But they don't abandon their identity entirely. Celtic brooches, jewelry, and decorative elements remain important. A man might wear an Anatolian-style tunic, but he fastens it with a Celtic fibula inherited from his father. A woman might adopt local sandals, but she keeps her Celtic torques and bracelets. Clothing becomes a negotiation between comfort and identity, with each person finding their own balance. Food preparation adapts to the heat. The hearth, central to Celtic homes in Gaul, is used less frequently. Cooking moves outside when possible, done in the early morning or late afternoon. Clay ovens built in courtyards become common. They heat up quickly and retain warmth without making the whole house unbearable. Cold meals become more acceptable. Bread, cheese, olives, and oil make a perfectly good meal that requires no cooking. This would have seemed wrong back home, where a hot meal was the mark of a proper household. Here, it's just smart. Preserved foods take on new importance. The Celts were always skilled at smoking meat and fermenting vegetables. Those techniques still work, but the heat adds urgency. Food spoils faster here. Meat must be salted, smoked, or consumed quickly. Fermented drinks, beer, where barley is available, or wine, are safer than water from questionable sources. The Galatians become more careful about storage, learning from local techniques. Underground cellars, stone jars sealed with wax, and covered pots stored in the coolest part of the house all become standard. Festivals shift timing. The old Celtic celebrations were tied to agricultural cycles and seasonal changes. Those patterns don't map perfectly onto Anatolian seasons. Spring arrives earlier, harvest comes later. Winter, when it comes, is milder and shorter. The Galatians adjust their festival calendar, keeping the traditional names and rituals, but moving them to align with local reality. Samhain, marking the end of harvest and the beginning of winter, happens later. Beltane, celebrating spring, comes earlier. The changes feel wrong to the older generation, but the younger people accept them as necessary. Livestock management requires new strategies. Cattle, beloved by the Celts as a measure of wealth and status, struggle in the heat. They need more water, more shade, and careful grazing management. Some families reduce their herds, shifting to sheep and goats that handle the climate better. This is culturally difficult. Cattle aren't just animals. They're status symbols, religious offerings, and links to ancestral tradition. But practical concerns win out. Better to have thriving sheep than dying cattle. Health issues emerge that weren't common in Gaul. Heat exhaustion affects people who push themselves too hard. Skin problems develop from constant sun exposure. Illnesses that thrive in warmer climates appear. Dysentery, various fevers, and parasites from unfamiliar water sources. The Galatians learn by trial and error, combining their own herbal knowledge with local remedies. Healers swap information with Anatolian counterparts, discovering new plants with useful properties. Some Celtic remedies work here, some don't. Some local treatments prove more effective than anything the Celts brought with them. Childbirth and child-rearing adapt to the environment. Babies wrapped in wool. Standard practice in Gaul. Overheat in Anatolian summers. Lighter swaddling becomes normal. Children are kept indoors during peak heat hours. Weaning happens earlier, partly because breast milk alone isn't enough in the heat. Babies need water too. Infant mortality, always high, remains a concern. Parents watch anxiously through their baby's first summer, knowing the heat can kill as surely as cold ever did. The elderly struggle most with adaptation. They lived their formative years in Gaul, their bodies and habits shaped by that climate. The heat exhausts them. Some never quite adjust, spending their final years uncomfortable and homesick. Others find unexpected relief. The dampness of Gaul caused joint pain that eases in the dry Anatolian air. Old wounds ache less. Breathing comes easier. Some elders, expected to decline quickly, surprise everyone by thriving. The plateau's high, dry air suits them. Evening brings the best part of the day. The heat finally breaks. The sky turns colors that don't exist back home. Deep oranges, vivid purples, and streaks of gold. Families gather outside, eating, talking, and enjoying the cool. This is when storytelling happens, when the old traditions feel most alive. A grandfather tells tales of Gaul to children who've never seen it. A druid recites genealogies, maintaining the links between present and past. A warrior describes a battle, embellishing shamelessly, making everyone laugh. Nights are quiet, but not silent. Different insects make different sounds. Dogs bark at unfamiliar animals. Guards patrol settlements, watching for threats that are real. Bandits, wild animals, and threats that are imagined. Spirits, ghosts, and the lingering fears that come from living in an unfamiliar place. The stars wheel overhead, still strange, still beautiful. People sleep under thinner blankets than they ever needed before. Some sleep outdoors on flat roofs, catching breezes that don't reach inside. Life in the heat becomes normal, eventually. The body adjusts, the mind accepts. What once felt unbearable becomes simply how things are. The Galatians are learning to be people of the plateau, even as they remember being people of the forests. They're not one or the other anymore. They're both awkwardly incomplete. And that's how survival works. Not through perfect adaptation, but through good enough compromises that let you keep going. You're listening now, carefully, to the way words shift and merge in the markets, homes, and council meetings of Galatia. Language doesn't change all at once. It happens in small moments. A borrowed word here, a shifted pronunciation there, a grammatical structure that starts to feel natural, even though it comes from somewhere else. The Galatians still speak Celtic, but the Celtic they speak is becoming something unique, absorbing influences from every direction. Greek is everywhere. It's the common language of trade, diplomacy, and administration across Anatolia. Any Galatian who deals with outsiders needs at least basic Greek. Merchants learn it first, out of necessity. They need to negotiate prices, understand weights and measures, and read contracts that increasingly govern transactions. Young people pick it up from the marketplace, absorbing it unconsciously through exposure. Within a generation, most Galatians are bilingual to some degree. But they don't just learn Greek, they bend it to their purposes. Galatian accented Greek becomes recognizable. The pronunciation shifts, shaped by Celtic phonetic patterns. Grammar gets simplified in predictable ways. Certain Greek words are adopted wholesale into Celtic speech when there's no good equivalent. The Greek word for olive, for instance, enters Galatian vocabulary because olives didn't exist in Gaul. Why invent a word when one already works? The same happens with architectural terms, administrative titles, and tools specific to Mediterranean life. Celtic holds its own in private spaces. Families speak it at home. Druids use it for religious instruction. Warriors default to it among themselves, especially when they want to talk freely without being understood by outsiders. There's a prestige to maintaining Celtic. It marks you as truly Galatian, not just someone who lives in Galatia. Parents insist their children learn proper Celtic, even as those children increasingly mix it with Greek in casual speech. The native Anatolian languages complicate things further. Phrygian, Lycaonian, and other local tongues are spoken by the indigenous population. The Galatians need to interact with these people, their neighbors, trading partners, employees, and increasingly, family through intermarriage. Bits of these languages creep into Galatian vocabulary too. Names of places, plants, and local customs resist translation, so they're simply adopted with their original names. A Galatian might use a Greek verb, a Celtic noun, and a Phrygian place name in the same sentence without thinking twice. Children grow up code switching naturally. They know Celtic is for home, Greek is for the market, and sometimes Phrygian is useful with the servants or farm workers. They don't think of themselves as speaking multiple languages so much as speaking the language of their world, which happens to draw from several sources. Adults who learn their languages in sequence rather than simultaneously find this both impressive and slightly troubling. It's efficient, certainly, but it also feels like dilution. Writing creates its own tensions. Celtic traditionally wasn't written. The Druids prohibited writing down sacred knowledge, fearing it would be corrupted or misused. But in a world where Greeks write everything, contracts, letters, records, the prohibition becomes impractical. Some Galatians start using Greek script to write Celtic phonetically. This is controversial. Traditionalists see it as a violation of sacred law. Pragmatists argue that it's necessary for survival in a literate world. The debate continues for generations without resolution, but slowly literacy spreads. Names blur and shift. A Galatian child might receive a Celtic name at birth, but adopt a Greek name for business dealings. Some people end up known by different names in different contexts. A warrior, called Brenos by his family, might introduce himself as Pyrrhus to Greek clients. Women, who often manage household trade, become particularly skilled at this linguistic flexibility. They're the ones negotiating in markets and speaking with diverse people daily. And they develop a practical multilingualism that men sometimes lack. Marriage accelerates language blending. When a Galatian man marries a Greek woman, or a Galatian woman marries a Phrygian man, the children grow up in genuinely multilingual households. These families develop their own hybrid speech patterns. A Greek mother might sing lullabies in Greek while speaking functional Celtic with her husband's family. The children absorb everything, creating their own linguistic mix. Within 2 generations, some families speak something that's hard to classify as either Celtic or Greek. It's simply Galatian, a new dialect born of necessity. Religious language remains conservative. Prayers, rituals, and sacred formulas stay in Celtic. The Druids insist on this. Religious continuity requires linguistic continuity. Even Galatians, who barely speak Celtic anymore, memorize the old prayers, reciting them phonetically if necessary. This creates a strange situation, where the religious register of Celtic becomes frozen, almost archaic, while everyday Celtic continues evolving. It's like having 2 versions of the language, one sacred and unchanging, one practical and fluid. Legal terminology presents challenges. Celtic law was complex, nuanced, and based on centuries of accumulated precedent. Translating it into Greek or explaining it to non-Celts is difficult. Some concepts don't translate well. The Celtic idea of honor price, for instance, the specific value assigned to a person based on social status, used to determine compensation for injuries or insults, doesn't map neatly onto Greek legal concepts. Galatian judges find themselves explaining, compromising, and sometimes creating hybrid legal frameworks that blend Celtic principles with Greek procedural norms. Humor gets complicated. Jokes often don't translate. Wordplay that works in Celtic falls flat in Greek, and vice versa. Some bilingual Galatians develop the ability to be funny in both languages, but it's not universal. Humor is deeply cultural. What's hilarious in one language can seem crude or incomprehensible in another. This creates social awkwardness. A Galatian trying to make Greek colleagues laugh might just confuse them. A Greek joke told at a Galatian gathering might offend by accident. People learn to be careful. Music and poetry adapt slowly. Celtic bards traditionally memorized and performed epic poems in strict meters. Those meters are based on Celtic phonology. When Greek words enter the language, they disrupt the meter. Bards face a choice: maintain purity and limit vocabulary, or evolve the forms to accommodate new linguistic reality. Most choose a middle path, using Greek words sparingly and only when they fit the meter. But some young bards experiment with Greek poetic forms, creating hybrid compositions that horrify traditionalists and delight audiences. Insults and profanity blend enthusiastically. People borrow curse words from whatever language offers the most satisfying expression. Greek has excellent words for certain kinds of insults. Celtic has others. Phrygian contributes a few particularly crude terms. Multilingual profanity becomes an art form. A truly angry Galatian might unleash a stream of invective that switches languages 3 times in one sentence, each transition emphasizing a different shade of outrage. It's oddly poetic in its way. The language change is gradual enough that no single generation notices it completed. An old woman in her final years might complain that young people don't speak properly anymore, but those young people think they speak perfectly well. They're just speaking Galatian as it exists in their time. not Galatian as it existed 2 generations ago. The language is alive. It changes because the people who speak it are changing, adapting, and living in a world that requires flexibility. By the 2nd century BCE, Galatian Celtic is distinct from the Celtic spoken in Gaul. A traveller from France would recognize it as related but strange, familiar words pronounced oddly, unfamiliar words mixed in, and sentence structures that feel slightly off. The Galatians still insist they speak Celtic, and they do. But it's a Celtic that's been through Anatolia's heat, Greek structure, and time's inevitable evolution. It's becoming its own thing, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. You're standing in a market now, at least in imagination, watching goods and money and words change hands in the complicated dance of commerce. The Galatian economy is a hybrid thing, mixing Celtic traditions with Mediterranean realities. Trade is what connects them to the wider world, what makes them valuable to their neighbors, and what slowly transforms them into something more than just relocated Celts. The Galatians control crucial territory. The Anatolian plateau sits at the intersection of east-west and north-south trade routes. Caravans moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean pass through Galatian lands. Traders carrying goods from Syria to the Aegean need Galatian permission or protection to travel safely. This geographic position gives the Galatians leverage. They charge tolls, sell provisions, offer guards, and generally profit from other people's movements. Celtic metalworking skills prove valuable. The Galatians are skilled ironworkers, a craft they brought from Europe. Iron weapons, tools, and decorative items from Galatian smiths earn a reputation for quality. They understand techniques that some Anatolian craftsmen don't, and they're not shy about selling their expertise. Galatian swords become desirable trade goods. So do iron plough blades, axes, and decorative ironwork for wealthy Greek homes. A skilled Galatian smith can prosper, bridging 2 worlds through his craft. Livestock remains central to Galatian wealth, though the animals change. The cattle-based wealth of Celtic Gaul doesn't work as well here, but sheep and goats thrive. Wool production becomes significant. Galatian wool isn't quite the same as Greek wool. The sheep are different, and the processing methods are slightly altered, but it's good quality and in demand. Wool merchants become important figures in Galatian society, accumulating wealth and influence through trade networks that stretch across Anatolia and beyond. They export what they have and import what they need. Galatian goods include wool, leather, metalwork, and mercenary services. They import grain from regions with better farmland, olive oil in massive quantities, wine, luxury goods from Greece, and specialized tools they can't make themselves. The balance isn't always favorable. Some years the Galatians need more grain than they can pay for. Debts accumulate. Relationships with trading partners grow tense, but other years, military contracts bring in enough silver to settle accounts, and then some. Greek merchants operate throughout Galatia, acting as intermediaries between the Galatians and the broader Mediterranean economy. These merchants speak multiple languages, understand both Celtic and Greek business customs, and make their living bridging cultural gaps. Some settle permanently in Galatian territory, marrying local women and raising bilingual children who inherit both trading networks and cultural flexibility. Others come seasonally, timing their visits to avoid the worst heat while still catching market days and festivals. Markets become multicultural spaces. A typical market in Ancyra by the late 3rd century BCE includes Galatian farmers selling wool and livestock, Greek merchants offering imported pottery and wine, Phrygian craftsmen selling local textiles, Jewish traders dealing in dyes and spices, and Armenian metalworkers peddling copper goods. Languages mix, prices are negotiated in whatever tongue works. Credit is extended on the basis of reputation rather than legal contracts, though that's starting to change as Greek-style written agreements become more common. Money itself is a hybrid affair. The Galatians initially continued using Celtic forms of exchange, cattle as a measure of value, precious metal weighed rather than coined, but they quickly adopted Greek coinage. It's just more practical. You can't split a cow to pay for bread, but you can count out small silver coins. Some Galatian chiefs start minting their own coins, copying Greek designs but adding Celtic symbols or names. These coins are legal tender within Galatia and generally accepted elsewhere, though sometimes at a slight discount. Banking, Greek style, creeps into Galatian life. Greek temples and merchant houses offer loan services. Interest rates are steep but predictable. Galatian families needing capital for business ventures or to pay taxes borrow from these sources. It's alien to Celtic tradition, where lending was personal and often interest-free, but it works in a monetized economy. Some Galatians become quite sophisticated about finance, understanding credit, debt instruments, and even rudimentary insurance schemes. Trade partnerships form between Galatian and Greek families, spanning generations. A Galatian wool producer develops a relationship with a Greek merchant house. They trade on credit, trusting each other to deliver goods and payment as agreed. When the Galatian dies, his son inherits not just the sheep, but the trading relationship. The Greek merchant, now older, introduces the young Galatian to his own son. These relationships, built on mutual benefit and maintained through trust, become more important than formal contracts. They're the glue holding the regional economy together. Mercenary work is its own form of trade. Galatian warriors hire themselves out to various Anatolian kingdoms. The payment is good: silver, land grants, captured goods, and sometimes political influence. The work is dangerous but familiar. A Galatian warband might spend a campaigning season fighting for a king in the south, return home with their pay, and spend the winter farming and repairing equipment before hiring out again the next spring. This cycle brings wealth into Galatia, but also disrupts the agricultural calendar and strains families left behind. Women play significant roles in trade, more so than in purely Greek or purely Celtic contexts. Celtic tradition allowed women to own property and conduct business. Greek practice was more restrictive. Galatian women operate in both worlds, leveraging whichever tradition serves them better. A Galatian woman might manage her family's wool production, negotiate sales in the market, and use Greek legal forms to protect her property rights. She's not bound by either culture's limitations because she's navigating between them. Taxation becomes a reality under various overlords. The Galatians aren't fully independent. They pay tribute to the Seleucid Empire, then to Pergamon, then to Rome as power shifts. These payments are negotiated, resented, and occasionally refused, but generally paid. Tax collectors, Greek or native Anatolian bureaucrats, move through Galatian territory, assessing property and collecting shares. The Galatians learn to hide assets, negotiate assessments, and comply just enough to avoid military reprisals, while minimizing what they actually hand over. Craft specialization increases with trade. In Celtic Gaul, most families produced most of what they needed. Here, specialization makes more sense. One family focuses on wool production, another on metalworking, a third on leather tanning. They trade among themselves and with outsiders. This creates efficiency, but also dependence. A family that specializes too much becomes vulnerable to market changes. A bad year for wool prices can devastate a household that has nothing else to fall back on. Trade networks carry more than goods. Ideas move along the same routes. A merchant returning from Syria brings stories of Eastern kingdoms. A Greek teacher hired to tutor a Galatian chief's children introduces philosophical concepts. A Galatian warrior serving in a Seleucid army sees how other peoples organize their societies and brings those observations home. Trade is as much about information and culture as it is about wool and silver, though the participants might not describe it that way. Disputes over trade require resolution. Galatian traditional law meets Greek commercial law in the courts. Sometimes Galatian judges apply Celtic principles to Greek-style contracts. Sometimes Greek arbitrators try to understand Celtic honor-based agreements. It's messy. Precedents accumulate. A hybrid commercial law develops, understood by neither pure Celts nor pure Greeks, but functional for the Galatians who live between both worlds. Justice becomes pragmatic rather than traditional. The market is where the Galatians become most visible as a distinct people. You can see it in the hybrid goods: Celtic patterns on Greek pottery, Greek inscriptions on Celtic jewelry, mixed-style clothing, and bilingual shop signs. The market is noisy, chaotic, and practical. It cares less about cultural purity than about getting deals done. And in that pragmatic space, the Galatians find their role, not quite Celtic, not quite Greek, but something that works. You're approaching sacred spaces now, places where the Galatians try to maintain connection with powers that feel distant under this unfamiliar sky. Religion doesn't change as quickly as language or trade. It can't. Faith is about continuity, about maintaining links between past, present, and divine. But even the most conservative religious system bends under enough pressure, and Anatolia provides plenty of pressure. The gods traveled with the Galatians, or so everyone believes. The question is whether they arrived intact. The old sacred groves are gone, those deep forest clearings where druids performed rituals beneath ancient oaks. Anatolia has forests, but they're different. Pines and scrub, not the massive hardwoods that felt eternal. The first generation of druids makes do, consecrating new groves and declaring certain trees sacred, but everyone knows it's not quite the same. The numinous quality that made the old places feel charged with divine presence is harder to find here. Water remains sacred, at least. That's one continuity. Springs, streams, and rivers were holy in Gaul, dwelling places of deities and spirits. The same applies here. The Galatians identify sacred springs, make offerings, and maintain the old prohibitions about polluting holy water. But the water itself is different, scarcer, more precious. The sacred and the practical overlap uncomfortably. A spring might be holy, but it's also the primary water source for a village. How do you balance reverence with necessity? Animal sacrifice continues as the central religious act. Bulls when available, but more often sheep, goats, or pigs. The rituals follow the old patterns, prayers in Celtic, and careful examination of entrails for omens, with communal feasts afterward. But the heat complicates things. Blood spoils quickly. Meat must be consumed or preserved immediately. The timing of sacrifices shifts to cooler parts of the day. These are practical adjustments, but they accumulate. The rituals feel subtly different, and that difference troubles the traditionalists. Festivals adapt their timing and character. Lugnasad, the harvest festival, was celebrated in early August in Gaul. In Anatolia, harvest comes at different times depending on the crop. Do you celebrate when the calendar says to, maintaining tradition, or when the harvest actually happens, maintaining relevance? Different communities make different choices. Some prioritize the date, others prioritize the agricultural reality. Within a generation, Galatian religious practice fragments slightly, with regional variations multiplying. Greek religion surrounds them, impossible to ignore. The Greeks have temples, stone buildings dedicated to specific gods, with priests, rituals, and civic functions. Celtic religion was never like that. It was outdoor, informal, and priest-driven rather than temple-centered. But the Greek model is attractive in some ways. It's organized, respected, and integrated into social and political life. Some Galatians start adopting elements, not wholesale conversion, but borrowing. A shrine might be built in Greek style but dedicated to a Celtic deity. A ritual might incorporate Greek elements while maintaining a Celtic core structure. Syncretism, the blending of religions, happens gradually. The Galatians notice similarities between their gods and Greek ones. A Celtic god of thunder sounds a lot like Zeus. A fertility goddess shares attributes with Demeter. These aren't identical matches, and educated Druids would argue the distinctions. But at the popular level, the similarities seem more important than the differences. People start using Greek god names and Celtic god names interchangeably, or speaking of them as if they're aspects of the same divine reality. The Druids resist this mostly. Their role is to maintain tradition, and syncretism threatens that. But they're practical too. If ordinary Galatians are blending religions anyway, it is better to guide the process than lose influence entirely. Some Druids study Greek religion, looking for acceptable points of contact. Others become more conservative, insisting on strict adherence to Celtic forms. This creates tension within the Druidic class itself. Unity fragments into competing schools of thought. Ancestor worship remains constant. The Celts always honored their dead, believing ancestors watched over the living and deserved respect. This continues in Anatolia. Graves are maintained, offerings are made. Stories about the dead are told and retold, preserving memory and reinforcing family identity. This ancestor focus provides continuity that transcends geography. A Galatian child, born in Anatolia and never seeing Gaul, still knows the names and deeds of ancestors who lived and died in those northern forests. The past remains present through memory and ritual. Divination adapts to local conditions. Celtic Druids read omens in cloud patterns, bird flight and animal behavior. Anatolian animals and weather patterns are different, requiring reinterpretation. What does it mean when an unfamiliar bird species appears during a ritual? How do you read omens in summer storms that behave nothing like northern tempests? Druids develop new interpretive frameworks, blending old principles with new observations. It's innovation disguised as tradition, necessary for maintaining relevance. Some Galatians, especially those deeply involved in Greek society, adopt Greek religious practices more fully. They participate in Greek festivals, make offerings at Greek temples, and consult Greek oracles. This isn't necessarily rejection of Celtic religion. Many maintain both. But it's a shift in emphasis. Greek religion offers certain advantages. Temple-based worship fits urban life better than grove-based ritual, and Greek religious participation opens social and political doors. A Galatian businessman in Ankara might find it useful to be seen honouring Greek gods alongside the city's Greek population. The second and third generations worry the traditionalists most. Children raised in Anatolia don't have direct experience of Celtic religious sites. For them, the sacred groves are stories, not memories. They've never attended a major Celtic festival in Gaul, never seen how it was supposed to be done. Their religiosity is formed entirely in the hybrid Anatolian context. Druids try to educate them, teaching the old ways, but the children's experience of those ways is always mediated, always translated. The immediacy is gone. Women's religious roles evolve interestingly. Celtic religion included female druids and priestesses, though they were less common than men. Greek religion had female religious roles too, but different ones. Galatian women navigate both systems, sometimes claiming authority through Celtic precedent when Greek norms would exclude them. A Galatian woman serving as a priestess might reference Celtic tradition to justify her position while performing rituals that look increasingly Greek. She's creating something new while insisting it's ancient. Mystery cults, popular in the Greek world, attract some Galatians. These cults promise personal salvation, secret knowledge, and direct divine experience. They're very different from public Celtic ritual, but they appeal to individuals seeking something more personal than what traditional Galatian religion offers. Participation is usually secretive, making it hard to know how widespread it becomes, but references in later sources suggest some Galatians were initiated into mysteries, adding yet another layer to their religious complexity. Prayer changes subtly. Celtic prayer was often public and formulaic, spoken aloud as part of communal ritual. Greek religion included private, personal prayer. Galatians start adopting this too. A farmer might pray to a Celtic deity using Greek prayer forms, standing before a small household altar, making a private offering and speaking quietly rather than declaiming publicly. It's a small shift, but it reflects a changing relationship with the divine. Religion becomes more personal, less exclusively communal. By the 2nd century BCE, Galatian religion is recognizably Celtic, but also distinctly Galatian. The core, ancestor worship, druidic authority, seasonal festivals, divination, and animal sacrifice remains, but the forms have bent around Greek influence, Anatolian climate, and urban life. A druid from Gaul visiting Galatia would recognize the religion as related to his own, but would also notice differences everywhere. And he'd be uncertain whether those differences represent corruption or adaptation, loss or evolution. The Galatians themselves probably wonder the same thing. You're watching power shift now, slowly and then suddenly, as Rome extends its influence into Anatolia. The Galatians have been independent, more or less, for generations. They've served as mercenaries, allied with various kingdoms, and maintained their own territory. But Rome is different from the regional powers the Galatians are used to. Rome doesn't just want military service or tribute. Rome wants incorporation, administration, and ultimately transformation. The first contacts are indirect. Roman armies campaign in Anatolia against the Seleucid Empire in the early 2nd century BCE. The Galatians, often employed by the Seleucids, fight against Roman legions. It doesn't go well. Roman military discipline overwhelms Celtic individual valor. The Galatians learn painfully that their traditional fighting methods aren't effective against organized formations. Roman commanders note the Galatians' presence, their territory, and their potential as either allies or problems. After defeating the Seleucids, Rome doesn't annex everything directly. Instead, Rome creates a system of client states, allied kingdoms that maintain nominal independence while acknowledging Roman supremacy. The Galatians become one of these clients. It's a subtle arrangement. There's no Roman governor, no Roman garrison, and no obvious occupation. But there's an understanding. The Galatians will support Roman interests, provide troops when requested, and refrain from causing trouble. In exchange, Rome recognizes Galatian autonomy and protects them from other threats. This arrangement suits both parties initially. Rome gets stability on its eastern frontier without the expense of direct administration. The Galatians get protection and a powerful patron. But it's an unequal relationship. Rome's requests are effectively commands. When Rome needs auxiliary troops, the Galatians provide them. When Rome wants a particular leader installed, Galatian assemblies somehow reach that conclusion. The forms of self-governance remain, but the substance erodes. Roman roads start appearing. Officially, they're for commerce and communication, benefiting everyone. In practice, they're military infrastructure, allowing rapid Roman troop movement if necessary. The roads transform Galatian territory. Travel becomes easier, faster, and safer. Markets expand. Information flows more quickly. But the roads also make Galatia more accessible to Roman influence. Roman merchants, officials, and ideas arrive more easily. The roads are built by local labor, sometimes paid, sometimes conscripted, and the Galatians watch their landscape change to serve someone else's strategic needs. Taxation becomes formalized. Under Roman oversight, tax collection becomes systematic and predictable. This is simultaneously an improvement and an imposition. Systematic taxation is more fair than the arbitrary exactions of local strongmen, but it's also more thorough. Roman-trained tax assessors know every trick. They catalogue property, count livestock, and measure fields with professional efficiency. The tax burden probably doesn't increase much, but the certainty of collection does. It's harder to hide wealth or negotiate down what you owe. Roman law starts infiltrating Galatian legal practice, not replacing Celtic law entirely, but supplementing it. Roman officials offer their legal expertise for disputes, especially those involving Roman citizens or interstate commerce. Galatian judges, seeking fairness or just wanting to avoid Rome's displeasure, start referencing Roman legal principles. Over time, Roman law becomes the framework for certain kinds of disputes, while Celtic law remains for others. It's a divided system, functional but complicated. Latin enters the linguistic mix, though less pervasively than Greek. Latin is useful for dealing with Roman administration, but not essential for daily life in Anatolia, where Greek remains the common tongue. Some Galatian elites learn Latin, seeing it as a marker of sophistication and a practical skill for navigating Roman power, but ordinary Galatians rarely bother. They've already got Celtic and Greek to manage. Adding a third language seems unnecessary unless you're specifically courting Roman favor. Roman citizenship becomes available selectively to prominent Galatians. Citizenship offers legal protections, business advantages, and social prestige. Some Galatian aristocrats pursue it eagerly, seeing Roman citizenship as a prize worth having. This requires demonstrating loyalty to Rome, adopting Roman customs at least publicly, and sometimes using Latin names alongside Celtic ones. It's a personal decision with political implications. Gaining Roman citizenship doesn't erase Galatian identity, but it adds another layer, another allegiance, and another complication. Urbanization accelerates under Roman influence. Rome prefers dealing with cities rather than dispersed tribes. Cities are easier to tax, govern, and control. The Galatians are encouraged, sometimes pressured, to develop their settlements into proper cities with urban infrastructure, councils, and public buildings. Ancyra, the Tectosages center, grows into a real city with a Greek-style council, paved streets, and public baths. The transformation brings economic benefits, but also social disruption, as rural Galatians migrate to cities looking for opportunities. Roman military veterans settle in Galatia, receiving land grants as retirement bonuses. These settlers bring Roman culture, technology, and expectations. They're not colonizers in the aggressive sense. They're not displacing Galatians or seizing prime land. But their presence is felt. A Roman veteran settling near a Galatian village introduces Roman farming techniques, architectural styles, and social customs. His children grow up bilingual, marrying into Galatian families. The blending continues, now with Roman elements added to the Celtic Greek Anatolian mix. Religion stays out of Roman administrative focus, mostly. Rome doesn't care what gods you worship, as long as you participate in imperial cult ceremonies acknowledging the emperor's divine status. This is political, not theological. Most Galatians comply without much fuss. Adding one more ritual to an already complex religious calendar isn't a huge burden, but it does introduce a new element: worship as political loyalty rather than devotion. The distinction matters, even if most people don't think about it explicitly. Infrastructure improvements benefit daily life. Roman engineers build aqueducts, improving water supply. Roads connect previously isolated settlements. Markets expand as transportation improves. Public baths appear, introducing Roman bathing culture. The Galatians adopt these amenities enthusiastically. Public baths in particular become popular. They're practical in the heat, and they serve social functions similar to Celtic communal gatherings. The baths become places where Galatian and Roman culture mix in literal and figurative warmth. Coinage standardizes further. Roman currency becomes common, though Greek coins still circulate. Having a unified currency across the Eastern Mediterranean simplifies trade enormously. Prices stabilize. Cross-border commerce increases. The Galatians lose some monetary independence, but gain economic integration. It's a trade-off that mostly feels worthwhile, especially to merchants who benefit from expanded markets. Military service changes character. Galatian warriors still serve as auxiliaries in Roman armies, but now they're organized in Roman units with Roman training and equipment. They learn Roman military discipline, adopt Roman tactics, and serve far from home, in Spain, Syria, Egypt, wherever Rome needs troops. These soldiers return home changed, having seen the world and absorbed Roman military culture. They're still Galatian, but also something else: professional soldiers in an imperial system that spans continents. Roman administrative practices gradually replace Celtic tribal structures at the formal level. Chiefs become city councillors. Tribal assemblies morph into urban councils modelled on Greek and Roman patterns. The Druids lose official political influence as Roman legal and administrative systems provide alternative structures. Druidic authority becomes religious and advisory rather than political. This shift is never formally declared. It just happens incrementally as practical needs and Roman expectations reshape how Galatian society organizes itself. By the mid-1st century BCE, Galatia is a client kingdom thoroughly integrated into Roman systems while maintaining its distinct identity. An outside observer might see Galatia as Roman. A Galatian would insist they're still Galatian, just adapting to circumstances. Both perspectives are valid. Rome's administration is quiet, almost invisible, but deeply effective. It doesn't erase what came before. It absorbs it, reshapes it, and creates something that serves Roman interests while allowing local culture enough space to persist in modified form. You're witnessing the final stages now, watching as the distinct pieces of Galatian identity begin to merge into something harder to categorize. By the 1st century BCE, the 3rd and 4th generations live in Anatolia. These are people whose great-grandparents might have been born in Gaul, but who themselves have never known anything but this plateau, this heat, this mixed culture. They're fully Galatian, but Galatian now means something different than it did at the beginning. Intermarriage has been happening from the start, but its effects accumulate. A Galatian warrior marries a Greek woman in the 2nd generation. Their children are bilingual and bicultural. Those children marry, some to Galatians, some to Greeks, some to Phrygians or others. The next generation has ancestry from multiple sources. Families become genealogical tapestries, threads from different origins woven together. At what point does someone stop being Galatian and become something else? No one can say exactly. Identity becomes claimed rather than obvious, chosen rather than given. Physical appearance blurs too. The Celts were described by ancient writers as tall, light-skinned, and often with red or blonde hair. Mediterranean peoples tended toward darker features. Generations of mixing produce children who don't fit either description perfectly. Some Galatians retain obviously Celtic features, others look Mediterranean. Most fall somewhere between. Appearance stops being a reliable marker of identity. You can't tell whether someone is Galatian just by looking. You have to ask or listen to what language they speak first, or see how they introduce themselves. Names become wildly mixed. A man might have a Celtic personal name, a Greek middle name, and a Roman family name if his clan has gained citizenship. His sister might use a Greek name publicly and a Celtic one at home. Children receive names honoring multiple traditions, a daughter named for her Celtic grandmother and her Greek great-aunt. Name choices become statements of identity, ways of claiming connection to particular heritages, even as those heritages blend. Clothing styles settle into something hybrid. Daily wear is largely Mediterranean, practical for the climate, available locally and socially acceptable. But for special occasions, people bring out Celtic elements. A woman attending a wedding wears an Anatolian-style dress, but adds Celtic jewelry that marks her heritage. A warrior in Roman military service wears Roman armor on campaign, but keeps a Celtic sword as a personal weapon and status symbol. Clothing becomes code, signaling which aspects of mixed identity a person wants to emphasize in a given moment. Language undergoes the most visible transformation. By the 1st century CE, Galatian Celtic is markedly different from continental Celtic. It's still Celtic. Linguists would classify it as such. But it's been heavily influenced by Greek vocabulary, Anatolian phonology, and Roman administrative terminology. Someone speaking Galatian Celtic can make themselves understood to a Gaul with difficulty, the way a modern Portuguese speaker can communicate with a Spaniard. Technically possible, but labored. The two languages share roots but have grown apart. At the same time, fewer Galatians speak Celtic at all. In cities, Greek dominates. Rural areas maintain Celtic longer, but even there, Greek is necessary for dealing with authorities, merchants, and the wider world. By the 2nd century CE, Celtic survives primarily as a home language in conservative families and as a liturgical language in religious contexts. It's becoming what linguists call a heritage language, spoken by a shrinking population, valued for identity rather than utility, and gradually dying despite people's attachment to it. Religious practice becomes thoroughly syncretic. Temples to Celtic gods use Greek architectural forms. Prayers might be in Celtic but follow Greek liturgical structures. Some deities are worshipped under Greek names, with Celtic attributes or vice versa. The old strict separations, this is Celtic, that is Greek, matter less to ordinary worshippers. People want their prayers answered, their crops blessed and their children protected. Which deity you invoke, and in what language seems less important than sincerity and proper ritual. The Druids still distinguish, but even they make compromises. Christianity arrives in the 1st century CE, adding yet another element. Early Christian missionaries find the Galatians receptive, perhaps because their religious identity is already fluid. If you've accepted Greek gods alongside Celtic ones, adding the Christian God isn't such a leap. St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians, written in the mid-1st century, addresses the Galatian Christian community. The letter assumes Greek literacy and engages with theological concepts in Greek philosophical terms. These are Galatians comfortable operating in Greek intellectual frameworks while maintaining enough distinct identity to be identified as Galatian. Economic integration is complete. Galatia is fully embedded in Mediterranean trade networks. Galatian products, wool, metalwork, mercenary services flow outward. Imports, grain, oil, manufactured goods, luxury items flow in. The economy is no longer based on Celtic principles of cattle wealth and prestige exchange. It's a monetized, market-driven Mediterranean economy. Some old forms persist: gift exchange among elites, honor-based lending within communities. But the bulk of economic activity looks Roman. Money flows, contracts are written, debts are recorded. Political structures have been fully Romanized by the time Galatia becomes a Roman province, officially in 25 BCE. The last Galatian king, Amyntas, dies, and Rome decides direct administration is preferable to maintaining a client kingdom. The transition is smooth because the structures are already in place. Roman provincial government simply formalizes what's been informal. Galatian aristocrats continue governing locally, now as Roman magistrates rather than Celtic chiefs. The change is more about titles than substance. Power has already been Roman for generations, even when exercised by Galatians. Military identity remains the most consistently Celtic element. Galatian auxiliary units in Roman armies maintain distinct identity, traditions, and esprit de corps. They're known for particular fighting styles, particular weapons, and particular battle cries that reference Celtic heroes. Roman commanders value them precisely because they're different. This military conservatism preserves some Celtic culture that might otherwise disappear entirely. A young Galatian joining the auxiliary forces learns Celtic warrior traditions from veterans, passed down in an unbroken chain from the original migrants. Education shifts toward Greek models. Wealthy Galatians hire Greek tutors for their children. The curriculum is Greek: rhetoric, philosophy, literature, and mathematics. Celtic oral traditions persist in families, but formal education is Greek. This creates a bifurcated culture. Public intellectual life is Greek. Private family culture may remain Galatian. Young people become skilled at code switching, performing Greek identity in public while maintaining Galatian identity at home. It's exhausting but navigable. Rural areas change more slowly than cities. In isolated villages, Celtic remains the primary language into the 2nd century CE. Traditional customs persist. Seasonal festivals, agricultural rituals, kinship structures. These areas are poorer, less connected, and less influenced by urban trends. They become repositories of authentic Galatian culture, viewed nostalgically by urbanized Galatians who've forgotten how hard rural life actually is. The city-country divide parallels the Greek-Celtic divide, though imperfectly. By the 2nd century CE, being Galatian is more about identification than distinct culture. You're Galatian if you say you are, if your family claims that heritage, if you maintain some connection, however attenuated, to that history. The culture has blended so thoroughly with Greek, Anatolian, and Roman elements that outsiders often can't distinguish Galatians from other Anatolian provincials. But the Galatians themselves still know. They remember. They tell stories about ancestors who crossed the Hellespont, warriors who fought in strange lands, and families who adapted and survived. The blending isn't complete erasure. That's important to understand. Galatian identity persists, but in modified form. It's not the pure Celtic culture of 280 BCE. It's not Greek or Roman culture either. It's a genuinely hybrid culture, something created through centuries of adaptation, mixing, and survival. The Galatians become one of history's countless examples of people who changed to survive, and in changing, created something new worth preserving in its own right. You're stepping back now, looking at the whole arc, from Celtic migrants crossing into Asia Minor, to assimilated provincials who still call themselves Galatian 4 centuries later. What does this long, slow transformation tell us? What patterns emerge from watching a culture adapt, blend, and ultimately survive in unrecognizable form? First, culture is more flexible than it appears. The Celts who crossed into Anatolia didn't stop being Celtic immediately, but they didn't stay purely Celtic either. Culture bent around new circumstances without breaking. Language absorbed new words. Religion incorporated new practices. Social structures adapted to new realities. The changes weren't planned or coordinated. They happened piecemeal, individually, as people made practical decisions about daily life. But the accumulation of small changes produced a major transformation. Second, climate matters profoundly. We don't always account for how much environment shapes culture. The Celts developed their culture in cool, damp forests. That climate shaped everything: clothing, housing, food, work patterns, and even military tactics. Moving to hot, dry Anatolia forced changes in all those areas. You can't maintain wool-heavy clothing in Mediterranean heat. You can't farm the same way when rain is scarce. The environment doesn't determine culture, but it constrains and channels it. The Galatians adapted because staying the same would have meant suffering or death. Third, identity is claimed, not inherent. After a few generations, Galatian identity became more about assertion than ancestry. Mixed families chose which aspects of their heritage to emphasize. People could be Galatian in some contexts, Greek in others, and Roman in yet others. Identity became strategic and situational. This might seem like a modern phenomenon, but the Galatians demonstrate it was always possible. Identity is a story people tell about themselves, and stories can change. Fourth, language is central to cultural survival. Celtic lasted longer in some forms and places than others, but its decline tracked the broader decline of distinct Galatian culture. When fewer people spoke Celtic, fewer people maintained Celtic worldviews, myths, legal traditions, and religious practices. Language isn't just communication. It's a carrier of culture. Lose the language, and much else follows. The Galatians tried to maintain Celtic, but practical pressures eroded it. By the 2nd century CE, Celtic was dying in Galatia. By the 4th century, it was probably gone entirely. Fifth, religion adapts more slowly than language or dress, but faster than genetic ancestry. The Galatians maintained Celtic religious elements for centuries, while blending them with Greek and eventually Christian practices. Religion provided continuity, a link to ancestors and heritage, but it also proved flexible. Gods could be renamed, rituals modified, and sacred spaces relocated. The deep structure remained recognizable, even as surface forms changed. Religion was simultaneously the most conservative and most adaptable aspect of Galatian culture. Sixth, power shapes culture even without direct coercion. Rome didn't conquer Galatia and forcibly Romanize it. Rome established a framework of incentives, pressures, and opportunities that made adopting Roman practices advantageous. Roman citizenship offered benefits. Latin opened doors. Roman law provided security. The Galatians weren't forced to change. They chose to, rationally, because changing served their interests. This is how empires actually work most of the time. Force is expensive. Incentive structures are cheap and effective. Seventh, cultural change isn't loss exactly. It's transformation. The Galatians of 25 BCE weren't lesser versions of the Celts of 280 BCE. They were different, certainly. They'd lost some things: linguistic purity, religious distinctiveness, and political independence. But they'd gained too: literacy, economic integration, political stability, and cultural sophistication. Value judgments about cultural change are hard to make fairly. Is adaptation progress or decline? The answer probably depends on who you ask and what they value. Eighth, geography matters, but not deterministically. The Galatians could have ended up anywhere after their migration. They happened to settle in Anatolia, at a crossroads of trade and power. That location shaped everything that followed. Different circumstances would have produced a different outcome. History is contingent. Small decisions, random events, and chance encounters compound over time into major differences. The Galatians might have stayed in Greece, or pushed farther east, or turned back. Each choice would have led somewhere else entirely. Ninth, ordinary people shape history more than great leaders. We know the names of a few Galatian chiefs and Roman administrators, but the real transformation happened in homes, markets, and fields. It happened when a Galatian woman taught her half-Greek children both languages, when a farmer adopted new crops because they grew better, when a merchant learned to write contracts in Greek, when a family decided their children should have Greek names alongside Celtic ones. These millions of small decisions, made for practical reasons by people whose names no one recorded, created the actual history we're examining. 10th, nothing is permanent. The Galatians thought they were building something lasting. Some probably worried about losing their culture. Others embraced change. But from our perspective, we see that everything they built, the hybrid culture, the synthesis of Celtic and Greek and Anatolian elements, eventually disappeared too. Later, invasions and migrations reshaped Anatolia repeatedly. The Galatians were absorbed into larger historical currents. By the Byzantine period, Galatian identity was gone. The plateau they lived on persists. The city names sometimes remain, but the people and their culture are historical footnotes. And yet, 11th and finally, they mattered. For 4 centuries, the Galatians existed as a distinct people. They fought wars, raised families, built cities, worshipped gods, and struggled with the eternal human question of how to maintain identity while adapting to change. They left archaeological traces, inscriptions, coins, and burial goods. They left literary traces in references by Greek and Roman authors. They left genetic traces in modern populations. And they left conceptual traces in our understanding of how cultures blend, adapt, and transform. The Galatians demonstrate that cultural change is normal, that pure origins are myths, and that human flexibility is our species' greatest strength. The glass of the title refers to this. Looking through the Galatian experience, we see refractions of our own moment. We also live in times of migration, cultural contact, and hybrid identity. We also negotiate multiple languages, multiple loyalties, and multiple versions of ourselves. The Galatians experience isn't unique. It's a particularly well-documented example of processes that happen everywhere, always, whenever people move and cultures collide. We can learn from them not specific lessons, but something more subtle, an appreciation for the complexity of cultural change and the resilience of people navigating it. You're settling into the end now, letting the story wind down gently towards sleep. The Galatians are gone. Their language is dead. Their cities are ruins or buried under modern ones. But their experience echoes forward, touching questions we still ask about identity, change, and what it means to belong. Think about modern migrations. People move for the same reasons the Galatians did: opportunity, pressure, and hope for something better. They arrive in new places and face similar challenges. The climate is different, the language is foreign, the customs are strange. Should they adapt or resist? Most do both, finding their own balance between preservation and change. The specifics differ, but the pattern is ancient. The Galatians show us one version of how it works. Consider bilingualism and code switching. Many modern people live between languages, switching based on context. This feels normal to them and strange to monolinguals. The Galatians lived this reality. They navigated multiple linguistic worlds, choosing which language served a particular moment. It's cognitively demanding but culturally enriching. Bilingual people often report feeling like slightly different versions of themselves in each language. So did the Galatians, probably. The phenomenon isn't new. We've just developed terminology for it. Think about religious pluralism. Many societies now include people practicing different faiths, navigating public and private religious identities, and finding common ground despite theological differences. The Galatians did this too. They maintained Celtic practices while participating in Greek religion and eventually adopting Christianity. They made it work pragmatically because they had to. Modern religious pluralism faces different challenges, but the underlying questions, how much to assimilate, how much to maintain distinctiveness, and how to respect differences, are familiar from history. Consider the tension between local and cosmopolitan identities. Some people strongly identify with local place and tradition, others embrace global culture and mobility. Most navigate between these poles. Galatians embodied this tension. Rural Galatians clung to Celtic traditions. Urban Galatians adopted Greek cosmopolitan culture. Both were valid responses to their circumstances. Neither was right nor wrong. The tension was productive, creative, and human. Think about how empires assimilate without conquest. Rome didn't usually destroy cultures outright. It created systems where adopting Roman practices provided advantages. Modern globalization works similarly. English dominance isn't enforced by armies. It spreads because knowing English opens opportunities. Cultural homogenization happens through incentives as much as coercion. The Galatians experienced an early version of this. Their response, selective adoption, strategic adaptation, mirrors what many cultures do now when facing dominant global influences. Consider the role of trade in cultural exchange. The Galatians weren't just moving goods, they were moving ideas, practices, and genes. Trade routes were cultural exchange routes. This remains true. Modern globalization is driven by commerce, and cultural changes follow economic connections. The process is accelerated now, instantaneous rather than generational, but fundamentally similar. Contact through trade creates pressure to adapt and opportunities to blend. Think about second-generation experiences. Children of immigrants navigate their parents' culture and their birth culture simultaneously. They speak the heritage language at home and the local language everywhere else. They feel caught between, belonging fully to neither. This causes stress, but also creates resilience and flexibility. The second-generation Galatians lived this. Their children navigated Celtic homes and Greek streets. It wasn't easy, but it was survivable. Their descendants, fully assimilated, might have looked back with nostalgia or relief or both. Consider what gets preserved and what gets lost. Language usually goes first in cultural assimilation. Religion lasts longer. Names persist in modified form. Food traditions survive, sometimes long after other cultural markers disappear. The Galatians followed this pattern. Their Celtic language died, but Galatian identity persisted for centuries as a social and political category, even after the culture had largely blended into the Mediterranean norm. Cultural survival is uneven, selective, and unpredictable. Think about the relationship between culture and power. The Galatians started as outsiders, gained power through military service, and eventually lost independence to Rome. Their cultural trajectory tracked their political fortunes. When they had autonomy, they could maintain distinctiveness. When Rome administered them, they adopted Roman norms. Culture isn't just freely chosen, it's shaped by power, opportunity, and constraint. Understanding this helps us understand why cultures change and resist change in the ways they do. Consider the myth of cultural purity. We often imagine traditional cultures as pure and unchanging until modern contact corrupts them. The Galatians prove this wrong. Celtic culture in Gaul was already mixed, influenced by Greek and other contacts. The Galatians weren't pure Celts. They were one version of Celtic culture, already adapted to particular circumstances. Their transformation in Anatolia was simply another phase of ongoing change. Culture is always in motion. Purity is retrospective myth-making, not historical reality. Think about resilience and adaptation. The Galatians survived because they changed. They gave up parts of their culture to keep living. Was this success or failure? Both, probably. They didn't stay Celtic, but their descendants survived and prospered. Cultural preservation and human flourishing sometimes conflict. The Galatians chose flourishing. That choice deserves respect, not judgment. People in similar situations today make similar choices for similar reasons. Consider what it means to be Galatian in the end. By the 2nd century CE, Galatian identity was thin, a name, some stories, and a claimed heritage. But it still mattered to the people who held it. Identity doesn't need thick culture to be real. It just needs meaning to the people claiming it. Modern ethnic identities work similarly. Some are richly elaborated with language, religion, and customs. Others are mainly symbolic. Neither is more authentic. Both are real because people treat them as real. The Galatians invite us to think gently about cultural change, not as tragedy or triumph, but as process. Cultures mix, adapt, transform, and sometimes disappear. People navigate these changes as best they can, balancing competing demands, making trade-offs and creating new syntheses. There's loss in this. There's also gain. There's certainly life, human life, in all its messy complexity. And maybe that's the right note to end on. The Galatians lived. They faced displacement, adaptation, and transformation. They struggled. They survived. They raised children, who raised children who raised children. They built things, made art, told stories, and left traces. They were fully human, which means they were neither perfectly preserved nor completely erased. They changed, and in changing, they lived. The Anatolian heat that once felt so alien became home. The Greek words that once sounded foreign became their children's native tongue. The Roman administration that once seemed oppressive became normal bureaucracy. Time smooths everything eventually. What seems impossible becomes familiar. What feels foreign becomes home. The Galatians teach us this, if we're willing to learn. Now you can let it all drift away. The plateau with its rolling hills, the markets with their mixed languages, the temples blend traditions, the families navigating change. The Galatians found their way, imperfectly but genuinely. Their story is over, but stories like theirs continue everywhere, always, as long as people move and cultures meet and humans adapt to survive. Let the Galatian glass show its reflections one more time, then let it go dark. Sleep well. The history is old, the lessons remain, and somewhere in the space between past and present, the Galatians rest, their transformation complete, their story told. Welcome to a journey through mist and memory, where we'll walk together through the world of the Celts, a people who never built empires or conquered distant lands, yet shaped the very soul of Europe. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 800 BCE to the time of Christ, Celtic communities spread across the continent like wildflowers, each one distinct but connected by language, art, and a way of seeing the world that still whispers to us today. Let's settle in and travel back to a time before borders, before nations, to discover the gentle civilization that lived in rhythm with the land itself. You're standing in a clearing somewhere in Central Europe, and the year is around 800 BCE, though of course nobody's counting yet. The morning fog sits heavy between the oak trees, thick enough that you could almost believe it has weight. Somewhere in that fog, a cow lows softly, and you hear the distant clank of a bronze pot against stone. This is how the Celtic world begins. Not with a bang, not with armies marching, but with smoke rising from roundhouses and the smell of barley porridge cooking over fires that have been tended since before anyone can remember. The people here don't call themselves Celts, of course. That's a name the Greeks will give them much later, probably because they heard the word Keltoi somewhere and thought it sounded appropriately exotic. The people in this clearing would tell you they're simply the folk who live by the river bend, or near the old hill, or in the valley where the good clay comes from. What makes them Celtic, though nobody's putting it into words yet, is the way they've been doing things for generations. The language they speak rolls and lilts in a particular way. Their bronze smiths have been passing down techniques for making tools and jewelry that carry distinctive patterns, spirals and curves that seem to flow like water. When they bury their dead, they place certain objects in the graves, a favorite cup perhaps, or a beautifully made pin to fasten a cloak. Let's walk through this village with you. The houses are round, their walls made of woven hazel branches packed with clay and dung, which sounds unpleasant until you realize it's actually excellent insulation and smells mostly of earth and dried grass. The roofs are thick thatch, steep enough that rain runs right off. Inside, there's a central hearth that never quite goes out, even in summer, because starting a fire from scratch is tiresome work involving a bow drill and a lot of patience. The floor is packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that get replaced when they start to smell. Smoke finds its way out through the thatch, mostly, though the interior of these homes always carries a pleasant wood smoke smell that gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your dreams. There's something deeply comforting about it. That scent feels as if safety itself has an odor. The family who lives here, let's say 5 or 6 people, maybe 3 generations, don't have much by modern standards, but what they have is well made. There's a loom in the corner where someone's been weaving wool into cloth with a checked pattern. The wool has been dyed with plants from the surrounding countryside, yellow from lady's bedstraw, blue from woad, and red from madder root. The resulting fabric is soft and warm and will last for years. Against one wall, there's a shelf with pottery bowls, some plain and practical, others decorated with simple geometric patterns. There are bronze pins for fastening clothes, maybe a few amber beads from the distant Baltic coast, and evidence of trade networks that stretch farther than you might think. In a leather bag hang herbs for cooking and healing. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulated wisdom of generations, about which leaves help with stomach troubles, and which ones make the stew taste better. Outside, the village spreads in a loose cluster of similar roundhouses, maybe 20 or 30 of them. There are no straight streets, no city planning, just houses built where it seemed good to build them, near each other for company and safety, but not so close you can hear your neighbor's every conversation. Between the houses, children are playing a game that involves throwing stones at a mark drawn in the dirt. And they're arguing about the rules in that timeless way children have argued about rules since the invention of games. The fields beyond the village are small and irregular, following the contours of the land rather than imposing order on it. People here grow emmer wheat and barley, tend small gardens with peas and beans, gather hazelnuts from the woods, and keep pigs that forage in the forest. Cattle are wealth here. The more cows you have, the more important you are. But they're also deeply practical, giving milk, pulling ploughs, and eventually providing meat and leather. What you notice most, though, is the pace of things. Nobody's rushing. The smith works at his anvil with patient, practiced movements. The woman carding wool does so while chatting with her neighbor. 2 men repairing a section of fence stop regularly to discuss the best way to do it, disagree amicably, try it one way, then shrug and try it another. There's time for everything, because time itself feels different when the sun and seasons are your only clocks. The Celts are emerging here in Central Europe, not because they invaded or conquered, but because groups of people sharing similar languages and customs have been living, farming and trading together for so long that they've become a recognizable cultural family. They're not a unified nation. That concept doesn't exist yet, They're more like cousins who live in different valleys, but recognize each other's accents and appreciate each other's pottery styles. Now we're moving forward a couple of centuries to around 600 BCE, and something important has shifted. You're in the same general region. Let's say what will one day be Austria, but the village has grown, and more importantly, it's working with a new material, iron. The discovery that certain stones, when heated in a very hot fire with charcoal, produce a tough metal that holds an edge better than bronze. This changes things. Not overnight, of course. Change is almost never overnight, despite what the history books sometimes suggest. But gradually, iron tools appear, plows that can break tougher soil, axes that can clear forests more efficiently, and swords and spearheads that are cheaper to make than bronze ones. You're watching a smith work, and there's something almost meditative about it. The iron has been heating in the forge for a while now, brought to a temperature where it glows orange-red. The smith pulls it out with tongs and begins to hammer, and each strike of the hammer is deliberate and purposeful. Sparks fly, which would be exciting except the smith barely notices them anymore. This is his daily work, this transformation of earth into tool. The thing about iron is that it's more common than the copper and tin needed for bronze. This means more people can have metal tools, which means more forest can be cleared, more land can be farmed, and more food can be grown. And more food means more people, which means bigger settlements, which means more organization is needed, which means some people start to become more important than others. This is how you get the rise of Celtic aristocrats. Not through conquest or inheritance of divine right, but through the gradual accumulation of cattle, land, and the ability to host better feasts than your neighbors. In Celtic society, generosity is prestige. The person who can afford to throw a party where everyone eats meat and drinks imported wine, yes, they're already trading with Mediterranean peoples for wine, that person earns status and loyalty. Let's visit one of these aristocratic settlements, a hill fort that's been growing for generations. It sits on a prominent hill, naturally defensive, surrounded by ditches and ramparts made of earth and timber. Inside, there are still the familiar roundhouses, but some are larger than others, and the buildings are more densely packed. There's a communal area where people gather for festivals and markets, and the settlement of disputes. The chief's house is noticeably bigger, with more elaborate decorations. The doorposts are carved with spiraling patterns that seem to move in the firelight. Inside, the walls are hung with shields and weapons that are as much art as armament. Bronze shields with raised decorative bosses, swords with hilts wrapped in gold wire, and spearheads with intricate inlay work. But here's what's interesting. The chief isn't a king in the later European sense. He can't just order people around. His power comes from his ability to keep people happy, to mediate disputes fairly, to be generous with his wealth, and to throw those famous feasts. If he becomes tyrannical or stingy, people can simply leave and attach themselves to another chief. It's a surprisingly fluid system. The feasts are legendary, lasting days sometimes. Picture enormous cauldrons bubbling with beef stew, spit roasted pork, bread made from wheat that's been ground by hand, and honey mead in quantities that would make a modern person worried about everyone's liver. Musicians play harps and pipes. Poets recite long genealogies and stories of ancient heroes. People talk, laugh, argue, and occasionally fight, though fights at feasts are considered bad form and might get you banned from future gatherings. Celtic society at this point is organized into tribes, each with its own territory, and these tribes are further divided into extended family groups. Your identity is defined by your relationships, whose child you are, whose cousin, and whose client. There's a whole vocabulary for different kinds of relationships and obligations. If someone wrongs you, your entire extended family is obligated to help you seek compensation. If you wrong someone, your family helps pay the fine. This might sound restrictive, but it also means nobody faces the world alone. You're always embedded in a web of relationships, for better or worse. It's the opposite of the modern feeling of being an isolated individual, something that would seem utterly alien and rather sad to a Celt. The landscape is changing too. More forest is being cleared, more fields planted. But the Celts aren't trying to dominate nature, they're negotiating with it. Sacred groves remain untouched. Certain springs are holy. Some trees are so old and venerable that cutting them would be unthinkable. The land is full of spirits and gods, most of whom don't have temples or statues, but live in the rivers, mountains, and ancient oaks. By around 400 BCE, Celtic peoples are everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but spread across a remarkably large area, from Ireland in the west to what is now Turkey in the east, from southern Germany down through France and into Spain. This isn't because of some massive military campaign or organized migration. It's more like a slow diffusion, families and clans moving over generations, sometimes pushed by population pressure, sometimes pulled by the promise of better land or trading opportunities. You're traveling now, which in Celtic times means walking mostly. If you're lucky and wealthy, you might ride a horse or drive a cart, but most people experience Europe at walking pace, about 3 miles an hour, maybe 20 miles in a day if you're really pushing it. At this speed, you notice things. The way the light changes as you move from oak forest to open meadow, the sound of different rivers, the smell of the air in different regions. Let's say you start in what will become France. The Celts here will eventually be called Gauls by the Romans. The landscape is a patchwork of farmland and forest, with villages and hill forts scattered across the countryside. The people speak a Celtic language that your ancestors would have recognized, though the accent is different, and some of the words have shifted. You're welcomed in a village, because that's what you do. You welcome travelers. They're sources of news, entertainment, and trade goods. You're given food and a place to sleep, and in return, you share stories about where you've come from. This is how news travels in a world without writing or telecommunications, from mouth to mouth, village to village, slowly percolating across the continent. Moving eastward, you pass through regions where Celtic tribes have settled among other peoples, sometimes displacing them, sometimes intermarrying, and usually just living alongside them. The Celtic characteristic isn't racial or ethnic, it's linguistic and cultural. If you speak a Celtic language and follow Celtic customs, you're Celtic, regardless of who your grandparents were. In the Alps, you find Celts who have adapted to mountain life, building their villages on terraces, keeping goats and sheep more than cattle, and becoming experts at mountain passes that will still be used 2,000 years later. The mountain Celts have a reputation for being particularly tough and independent, which seems to be a universal characteristic of mountain people everywhere and always. Descending into the Po Valley in northern Italy, you encounter Celts who have settled in an area with a warmer climate than their ancestors knew. They've adopted Mediterranean crops, grapes and olives, while maintaining their Celtic identity. Some of them have started writing, using alphabets borrowed from the Etruscans and Greeks, though writing is still mostly for important inscriptions and accounting. The real knowledge, the stuff that matters, is still carried in people's heads and passed down orally. Further east, you reach Celtic settlements in what will become Romania and Bulgaria. These Celts have been here for generations now, and they've picked up influences from their neighbors, Thracians, Greeks, and eventually Dacians. Their art shows it, blending Celtic curves and spirals with local motifs. But they still speak a Celtic language and still organize their society in familiar ways. And then, remarkably, you reach Celtic communities that have settled in Asia Minor, in what is now central Turkey. These are the Galatians, who arrived here as mercenaries and warriors, but who have settled down to become farmers and craftspeople, like their Western cousins. They're surrounded by very different cultures, Greek cities, Persian influences, but they maintain their identity for centuries. What strikes you on this journey is both the diversity and the similarity. Each Celtic community has adapted to its local environment and neighbors, but everywhere you observe the same basic cultural patterns: the importance of cattle, the round houses, the spiral art, the elaborate metalwork, the bardic tradition of poets and storytellers, and the complex web of family and tribal obligations. You also notice what's missing. There are no Celtic capitals, no central government, and no empire. The Celts never developed the kind of political organization that the Romans or Greeks did. They remained a collection of tribes, sometimes allied, sometimes fighting among themselves, but never unified. This will eventually prove disastrous when faced with Roman military organization. But for now, in 400 BCE, it seems to be working fine. Why would you need a vast bureaucratic state when you have your tribe, your family, your chief, and your community? Let's slow down and spend some time in a Celtic household, because daily life is where culture really lives. Not in battles or politics, but in how people spend their ordinary hours. You wake before dawn in a roundhouse somewhere in Gaul. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to embers, giving off just enough warmth to take the chill off the morning air. Someone, probably whoever drew the short straw, metaphorically speaking, gets up to feed the fire, adding wood and blowing on the embers until flames catch. The smoke begins its lazy rise to the thatched roof. Breakfast is simple. Leftover bread from yesterday, maybe some cheese, and definitely milk if the cow has been milked yet. There might be porridge made from barley or oats, filling and warm. People eat with their fingers and wooden spoons. Forks haven't been invented yet, but honestly, who needs them? The day's work depends on the season. Let's say it's spring, so there's ploughing to be done. The family's ox is harnessed to an iron-tipped plough, one of those innovations that iron made possible, and you head to the fields. Ploughing is rhythmic work. The ox walks, the plough cuts through the earth, and you follow behind, keeping the plough steady and occasionally clearing rocks and roots from the blade. It's the kind of work that lets your mind wander, while your body does what it knows how to do. The smell of fresh turned earth is one of those scents that reaches something deep in human memory. It smells like possibility, like potential, like the promise that these seeds you're about to plant will become food. Celtic farmers know their land intimately, which fields flood in heavy rain, which dry out too quickly, and where the soil is richest. This knowledge isn't written down, it's handed down, with a child working alongside a parent, learning through doing. Back at the settlement, other people are engaged in their own tasks. Someone's weaving at the loom, the shuttle passing back and forth in a rhythm older than memory. The weaver is making a cloak, thinking about who will wear it, making it sturdy enough for winter, but not so heavy it can't be worn in spring. The wool has been spun by hand, which took weeks, and the weaving will take weeks more. Nothing is quick, but nothing is rushed either. A smith is working at his forge, and you stop to watch because smith work is always fascinating. Today he's making a knife, not an elaborate ceremonial piece, just a good practical knife for daily use. But even this simple knife will be beautiful, because beauty and functionality aren't separate concepts in Celtic thinking. Why make something ugly when you can make it pleasing to look at? The knife's handle will be carved with a simple pattern. The blade will be balanced and sharp. When someone uses this knife in 20 years, they'll still appreciate how well it fits the hand. Children are playing, always playing. They're racing sticks down the stream that runs past the village, building elaborate rules about which stick wins, and immediately arguing about whether that particular stick crossed the finish line first or second. Older children are helping with adult work, collecting eggs, watching the younger kids, learning to card wool, or helping the smith by pumping the bellows. Work and play blur together in childhood. Late afternoon, people start gathering. Celtic life is communal. Privacy, in the modern sense, barely exists. People cook together, eat together, work together, and talk together. The evening meal is the day's social event. Today, it's a stew made with leeks, beans, and a bit of salt pork for flavor. There's bread, dense and filling, probably a bit coarse by modern standards, but delicious when you're hungry from a day's work. As people eat, they talk. Someone tells a story about tracking a boar through the forest. Someone else complains about a neighbor's cow that keeps breaking through the fence and eating the barley. There's discussion about when to shear the sheep. Someone makes a joke that's probably been making people laugh for generations. Language flows around you, that distinctive Celtic lilt, words that sound like music. After the meal, as darkness falls and the fire is built up again, this is when the bard might begin. Bards are professionals, trained from childhood in the art of memory and verse. This particular bard knows hundreds of stories and thousands of lines of poetry. Tonight he's recounting the genealogy of the local chief, tracing his ancestry back 20 generations to a legendary hero who supposedly fought a giant. Everyone's heard it before, but that's not the point. The point is the hearing itself, the communal experience of sitting together in firelight while words weave pictures in the darkness. The bard's skill is in variation. He tells the same story differently each time, responsive to his audience, adding details or leaving them out, speeding up the boring parts and lingering on the good bits. This is living literature, literature that breathes and changes. It will never be fixed on a page, never be definitive. Each telling is unique, and that's the beauty of it. We need to talk about druids. But let's clear away some misconceptions first. Druids aren't mystical wizard types in robes performing magic under full moons. Well, they might be, but that's not the main point. Druids are intellectuals, priests, judges, teachers, astronomers, and keepers of cultural knowledge. They're the people who have spent 20 years or more memorizing Celtic lore, history, religious practice, and natural law. You're attending a legal dispute somewhere in Celtic Britain. Two farmers claim the same piece of land, both insisting their grandfather's grandfather cleared it and established ownership. There's no written deed, no property records. So how do you settle this? You call in a druid. The druid arrives and he's older, with the kind of face that suggests he's seen everything and found most of it amusing. He listens to both farmers make their case. He asks questions about landmarks, about where certain old stones are, and about family histories. Then he closes his eyes for a long moment, accessing that vast internal library of memorized knowledge, and finally pronounces judgment based on precedent, on traditional law, and on how similar cases have been settled before. His judgment is binding, not because he has an army to enforce it, but because rejecting a druid's judgment would mean rejecting the entire system that holds society together. It would mean putting yourself outside the community, and in Celtic society, that's not survivable. The farmer who loses the dispute might grumble, but he accepts it because the alternative is unthinkable. Druids also handle religious matters, which in Celtic society means everything from blessing crops to interpreting omens to conducting sacrifices. The Celts worship many gods, most of whom are associated with natural features or human activities. There's a god of the forge, a goddess of the river, and deities associated with war, healing, fertility, and wisdom. These gods don't live on some distant mountain. They're here, in the landscape, in daily life. Certain places are especially sacred: springs where the water emerges from the earth, groves of ancient oaks, and hilltops where you can see forever. At these places, people leave offerings, coins thrown into the spring, weapons deliberately broken and buried, and valuable objects given to the gods with no expectation of return. Archaeologists, centuries later, will find these offerings and puzzle over why anyone would throw perfectly good swords into bogs. The answer is devotion and the creation of sacred space where the human and divine worlds touch. The Druids oversee the calendar too, determining when festivals should be held. The Celtic year is divided by 4 major festivals, marking the turning of the seasons. Samhain, in late October, is when the boundary between the living and the dead becomes thin. Imbolc, in early February, marks the first stirrings of spring. Beltane, in May, celebrates fertility and growth. Lughnasadh, in August, is the harvest festival. These aren't just parties, though they are parties. They're times when the community comes together to mark the passage of time, to remember the dead, to celebrate the living, and to acknowledge that they're part of something larger than themselves, part of the eternal cycle of seasons and years. The Druids also teach, taking on students who will study for decades to learn what the Druids know. These students memorize epic poems, legal codes, genealogies, astronomical observations, herbal medicine, and religious rituals. All of this without writing it down, because the Druids believe, perhaps rightly, that written words are dead words, fixed and unchanging, while memorized knowledge lives and breathes. There's something remarkable about a culture that can maintain such sophisticated knowledge without writing. It requires a different kind of mind, one trained from childhood to remember, to connect, to recall vast amounts of information and deploy it when needed. We've lost this capacity, mostly, in our written and now digital age, but the Druids possessed it, and it served Celtic society well for centuries. The year is 58 BCE, and everything is about to change. Gaius Julius Caesar has been appointed governor of Transalpine Gaul, and he's ambitious in that particularly Roman way, where ambitious means willing to conquer entire peoples to advance your political career. You're in a Gaulish village, and you've been hearing troubling news from the south. Roman armies, disciplined and relentless in a way that Celtic warriors aren't, have been moving through Gaul. They don't fight like Celts fight. Celts favor individual combat, champions stepping forward to duel, and warfare as a kind of deadly sport. Romans fight in formation, each soldier part of a larger machine, grinding forward with methodical efficiency. The Roman advance is marked by a strange mix of violence and administration. They destroy villages that resist, but they also build roads, establish markets, and bring Mediterranean goods, wine, olive oil, and fine pottery. Some Celtic nobles make deals with Rome, seeing opportunity in alliance. Others resist, and their resistance is crushed. The thing is, the Celts might have stopped Rome if they'd been unified, but unity was never the Celtic way. Each tribe makes its own decision. Some fight, some submit, and some try to play Rome off against rival tribes. Celtic political fragmentation, which worked fine in a world of other Celtic tribes, becomes fatal when facing an organized imperial power. You hear about the battle at Alesia, where the Gaulish leader Vercingetorix made a last stand. Caesar besieged him in a hill fort, and when a massive relief army arrived, Caesar built fortifications facing both inward and outward, simultaneously besieging Vercingetorix and defending against the relief force. It was a brilliant, brutal piece of military engineering. When it was over, Gaul was finished as an independent Celtic land. But here's the interesting part. Roman conquest doesn't erase Celtic culture, it transforms it. Latin becomes the prestige language, but people still speak Celtic at home. Roman gods are identified with Celtic ones in a kind of religious syncretism. Towns grow up where villages were, with Roman-style buildings and Celtic roundhouses side by side. Celtic nobles send their sons to study in Rome, and they come back speaking Latin and wearing togas, but they're still Celts underneath. In Britain, the process is similar but slower. Rome invades under Claudius in 43 CE. Britain becomes a province, but only the southern and eastern parts really Romanize. The north and west remain stubbornly Celtic. Hadrian eventually builds his wall, essentially admitting that some Celts simply aren't worth the trouble of conquering. Ireland never gets conquered at all. The Romans knew it was there. They called it Hibernia, but they never invaded. Maybe it seemed too far, too poor, too difficult. Whatever the reason, Celtic culture in Ireland continues uninterrupted, evolving on its own terms. This will prove important later. Let's visit Roman Britain around 150 CE in a town that was a Celtic village a century ago. The transformation is visible everywhere. There's a forum with stone columns where the market used to be. Roman-style houses with painted plaster walls stand beside traditional roundhouses. People wear both togas and traditional Celtic cloaks, sometimes in bewildering combinations. The local magistrate is a Celt whose grandfather fought the Romans. He has a Latin name now, but he still speaks the Celtic language at home. He successfully navigated two worlds, keeping one foot in each culture. His children are learning Latin grammar and rhetoric, but also hearing old Celtic stories from their grandmother. This mixing, this cultural blending, is how the empire actually works at ground level. Not through erasure, but through adaptation. The Celts have given Rome more than they perhaps realize. Celtic metalworking techniques influence Roman craftspeople. Celtic cavalry tactics are adopted by Roman armies. The Celts' knack for making excellent beer spreads through Roman Britain. Wine is prestigious, but beer is cheaper, and many people prefer it anyway. Celtic art, with its curves and spirals, begins showing up in Roman mosaics and metalwork, disguised as decoration, but unmistakably Celtic in spirit. Language persists in place names. Rivers and hills keep their Celtic names even as Latin becomes the official language. Centuries later, these names will still be there, testifying to the people who named them. The Thames, the Severn, London itself. All Celtic names surviving in a Latin and later English-speaking world. In the countryside, far from Roman towns, Celtic life continues with minimal change. Farmers farm the same fields their ancestors farmed. Village life revolves around the same rhythms. The gods might have Roman names in official contexts, but everybody knows who they really are. The old stories are still told, though now they might include a heroic encounter with a Roman legion or two. The Druids have been officially banned. Rome distrusts organizations it can't control, but their knowledge persists in unofficial ways. Certain elders know the old laws. Certain poets remember the genealogies. Certain healers use the traditional herbs and treatments. The formal structure of Druidic education is gone, but the knowledge seeps through in 1,000 small ways. Now we're going to take a long step forward to the present day and go looking for the Celts in modern Europe. You might think they're gone, erased by Romans, by Germanic migrations, by medieval kingdoms and modern nations. But you'd be wrong. The Celts didn't disappear. They changed, adapted, and persisted. Start in Ireland, the one place that was never conquered by Rome. Irish Gaelic is still spoken, taught in schools, and used in daily life in some Western regions. The language has survived 1,500 years of external pressure, English rule, famine, and emigration. It's still here, a direct descendant of the Celtic languages spoken when Caesar was conquering Gaul. Irish mythology, written down by medieval monks, preserves stories that are fundamentally Celtic. Tales of heroes like Cuchulainn, of the Tuatha De Danann, and of a world where the supernatural and everyday intersect. These stories were old when they were written down, having been passed orally for generations before anyone thought to record them. Move to Scotland, where Scottish Gaelic survives in the Highlands and Islands. It's endangered, certainly, but there are still communities where it's the first language, where children grow up speaking it at home. Celtic patterns still appear in modern Scottish art, in jewellery, and in textiles. The persistence is remarkable. Wales has maintained Welsh, another Celtic language, with perhaps the most success of all. Over 500,000 people speak Welsh today, and it has official status. Welsh television broadcasts exist, and Welsh language schools thrive. The language that was spoken when the Romans arrived is still spoken, evolved but recognizable. Brittany in northwestern France speaks Breton, brought there by Celts fleeing Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Breton is related to Welsh and Cornish, a piece of living linguistic history. It struggled in recent decades against French cultural dominance, but revival efforts are underway. Even in England, which is thoroughly Germanized linguistically, Celtic traces remain. Those place names we mentioned, dozens of rivers called Avon, meaning simply river in Celtic, and countless hills and towns with Celtic origin names. The landscape itself remembers. Celtic artistic motifs show up in surprising places. That spiral pattern you see in modern jewellery, Celtic. Those interlaced designs, Celtic by way of early medieval Ireland. The Celts' artistic vocabulary has become part of European aesthetic heritage, often without people realizing its origin. Celtic festivals have persisted too, transformed but recognizable. Halloween is Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead, with a Christian veneer. May Day celebrations echo Beltane. These aren't conscious survivals. Few people dancing around a maypole think, I'm celebrating a Celtic fertility festival. But the continuity is there if you look for it. The political structure of ancient Celtic society, tribal, decentralized, and based on kinship and personal loyalty rather than abstract citizenship, has echoes in the clan systems that persisted in Scotland and Ireland into the modern era. The emphasis on hospitality, on elaborate gift-giving, and on the importance of one's word, these Celtic values shape the culture of northwestern Europe in ways that are still visible. As we near the end of our walk through Celtic history, let's think about what this gentle civilization contributed to European culture, not through conquest or empire building, but through the quiet influence of their way of life. The Celts showed that you could have a sophisticated culture without cities, that you could maintain complex knowledge without writing, and that you could organize society around relationships rather than institutions. They demonstrated an approach to life that valued beauty for its own sake, that saw no division between the practical and the aesthetic, and that understood humans as part of nature rather than separate from it. Their art influenced everyone who came after. Those spirals and curves, that sense of flow and movement, that ability to make even a simple tool beautiful. This became part of European aesthetic sensibility. Medieval Irish manuscripts, with their elaborate interlaced patterns, are direct descendants of Celtic artistic traditions. The Book of Kells is a Celtic masterpiece created 1,000 years after the classical Celtic period ended. The Celtic approach to storytelling, oral, flexible, participatory, shaped European narrative traditions. The medieval romances about King Arthur? That's Celtic storytelling filtered through French and English writers. The emphasis on heroes, on loyalty, on the tragic impossibility of perfection, these are Celtic narrative concerns. Celtic attitudes toward the natural world, the sense that the land itself is sacred, that certain places are holy, and that spirits inhabit the landscape. This animistic worldview persisted long after official Christianization. Holy wells, sacred groves, pilgrimages to hilltops. These practices continued with Christian rather than pagan explanations, but the underlying sensibility is Celtic. The Druids' approach to knowledge and the emphasis on memory and oral tradition shaped early medieval Irish Christianity in particular. Irish monks became famous for their learning, their manuscript illumination, and their preservation of classical texts. They carried this love of knowledge, learned from Druids, adapted to Christian purposes, back to continental Europe during the early Middle Ages, helping to preserve learning during difficult centuries. Celtic languages influenced the Romance languages, spoken in former Celtic territories. French, Spanish, and Portuguese all have Celtic substrate elements, words and grammar quirks that come from the Celtic languages spoken in these regions before Latin arrived. The influence is subtle but real, a linguistic ghost haunting the modern languages of Europe. Perhaps most importantly, the Celts demonstrated a way of being European that wasn't Roman or Germanic, a third option, a different way of organizing society and thinking about the world. They showed that you could be sophisticated without being imperial, civilized without being militaristic, and cultured without building vast centralized states. As our hour together draws to a close, you're standing again in that misty clearing where we started. But now you're seeing it differently. You understand that this place, these people, isn't isolated or primitive. They're part of a vast cultural tradition that will spread across Europe and persist for millennia. The Celts never built an empire, never conquered distant lands, and never imposed their language and culture through military force. They simply lived, farmed, made beautiful things, told stories, and passed their culture from generation to generation. And that turned out to be enough. Not enough to avoid being conquered by Rome, perhaps, but enough to outlast Rome in other ways, to leave traces that remain visible 2,000 years later. When you visit Ireland and hear someone speaking Irish Gaelic, you're hearing a Celtic language. When you see Celtic patterns in jewelry or artwork, you're seeing an aesthetic tradition thousands of years old. When you encounter attitudes toward hospitality, storytelling, or the natural world in northwestern Europe, you're often encountering ideas that have Celtic roots. The Celts remind us that there are many ways to be civilized, many ways to build a culture, and many ways to live meaningfully. They remind us that beauty matters, that stories matter, that relationships matter, and that the land itself matters. They remind us that sometimes the loudest cultures in history, the ones that build the biggest monuments and conquer the most territory, aren't necessarily the ones with the most lasting influence. The Celtic civilization shaped Europe quietly, like water shaping stone, persistent and patient. And if you know how to look, you can still see their influence everywhere, hiding in plain sight, in place names and languages, in artistic motifs and cultural attitudes, and in the very landscape of northwestern Europe. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself in that Celtic village, with firelight flickering on roundhouse walls, the smell of wood smoke and cooking, and the sound of voices speaking a language old beyond measure, telling stories that will be told again tomorrow and the day after, and down through the years, persistent and gentle as rain, shaping the world through the simple act of continuing, of being, of remembering. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full of ancient forests, spiral patterns, and the quiet wisdom of a people who knew that the best way to change the world is simply to live well in it.